Alright, we're gonna do a quick tutorial on how to perform network calls on Android. So by the end of the tutorial, you should have an application that has a text view, and then it will load up the data. What you will do with the data later on will be different, but what we're doing is we're just filling up our text view with a state of JSON data. And the data is coming from this URL, which is a long list of traveling costs and whatnot. So we'll use that for example. And let's get started. So the very first thing we'd like to do is to have the internet permission in our application to be able to actually communicate with the outside world. This is not considered a dangerous permission. So if you're working with like Android Marshmallow or Nugget, you do not have to worry about runtime permissions. So just putting it in there will be good enough. And let's go ahead and quickly look at our layout. As you saw, we're just have a very basic text view right on the center. So there's nothing very special here. It has the ID of content main. So we will access that using the ID later on. And okay, let's go ahead and look at our onCreate method. The very first thing we'd like to do is be able to find your text view, and we'll create an object of it. We will need to do this because later on we will update the contents of it on a different location. So let's just go ahead and have a member method in our class. And to be able to initiate the network call, first and foremost, we'd like the URL, and that's the URL that we had over here. And it will be a list of JSON files a little bit longer to be able to fit, and this is not a scroll view, so there is more stuff down below as well. Um, so we'll start by creating a URI object, and we'll just simply use the static parse method provided by the URI class, and the URL that we'll see in our browser, we'll just copy and paste it in there. If you have a more specific thing where it might have authentication or parameters, you'll have to add or create a string specific to that. But for now, it's just a very simple static URL here. And using the URI, which is simply the identifier, we'll have to create a URL to actually be able to locate and open a connection. So we'll use the class that we just created, URI, and we'll create a URL object. Creating that will allow us to open a connection and then access the JSON data. So since I believe Gingerbread, you cannot, and frankly you should not run anything that has to do with network on the main UI thread. So we're going to create an SyncTask to be able to perform the network call on the background. So we'll create a new SyncTask, which is this fancy class down here, and we will execute it by passing a parameter with it as well, the URL that we just created. So in our SyncTask class, we will have uh, the URL, which is the incoming parameter. So we'll have to set the first one to URL. The second one we will not be worrying about this time. And a string which will be the final result, which is the parsed JSON in a string object. So we'll create two methods to be able to access and modify the data. We'll have a to-do background method, which will be running in the background and will not interfere with the UI thread. The incoming parameters is URL, which is also declared here as well. So if you're getting an error or a wrong object, you should look down here. It's using the dot 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 format, so you could actually pass multiple objects here as well. If you have multiple URLs or you like to access different websites in combination of other ones, so you could pass multiple URL objects. But for this case, we only have just one of them. So in our case, we'll just simply use the um, static accessing of array of just 0. And this shouldn't cause any problems because we know we only have one. So we'll have our URL incoming, and we'd like to start the network process. So let's go ahead and look at our network utility class. And this is a very basic helper method slash class to be able to access tokens that can be accessed using our URL that we have in here. So it's the very same URL that we passed from our execute. It's coming in here, and then we'll pass it to our helper method as well. And we will use that URL class to be able to open a connection, open an input stream, and our scanner to be able to read the tokens one by one. After initializing the input and scanner, we will use a delimiter. In our case, we're using a \a, which is the beginning of the input. And it's kind of a nice and hacky way, I guess, of accessing all the data at once, because there will be one beginning of the uh, input. So it will be able to access all of those in one iteration. And using that, we'll check if there is a token available. And if there is, this is a Boolean method, so we'll say if they had one or no. If they do, then we'll just simply return the next token. Or if there wasn't, we'll just return an empty string. Or if you'd like, you could return a null here as well. And finally, after finishing up, we have to close our scanner and make sure our URL connection is disconnected. So our network utility HTTP response method, as you looked at, returns a string, which is the value returned by scanner.next, or if it might also be an empty string. And we'll simply return that directly in our do in background method as well, which will cause our on post execute method to be called in this case. And this is where we would like to manipulate any sort of UI object that we have, which in this case is our text view. So you cannot manipulate anything in our do background because we will have you will have some exceptions thrown. And in this case, we were simply returning this string object, and when we return it, it will be passed in as a parameter on our post execute. And at this point, you could do further checking if you'd like. You could say if the result JSON is empty, then you could do, for example, main content.setText not found in a case where the data was not available. And if it is not, then in that case we'll just set the value to the result JSON that we received. So I think that covers most of it. Let's go ahead and run the app again. You'll see that it starts by having the hello word, which was the text set on default in our UI, but then it will run the network call in the background, and after it is done, which takes a little bit, it will update the contents of our text view to our result JSON. Okay, and I believe that covers the tutorial. And the code again is available on GitHub, so if you'd like to go over that as well, you may do so.